Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's event on decolonising Irish history. My name is Cuimhne Ovaid, and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of History here at the Department of History at the University of Sheffield, and I'll be chairing today's event. I want to start with a couple of words of thanks. We're very grateful for the support of Torch Oxford, in particular Nikki and Sarah, and also for support from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. So just a little bit of an introduction to the themes that we'll be discussing today. Irish history, of course, sits in a complicated position in relation to the very current and relevant questions around decolonising the curriculum, with the nature and extent of British colonisation in Ireland, shifting conceptions of whiteness, Irish emigrant experiences in all their diversity, and Irish participation in the British imperial project, all posing difficult questions to be untangled. On the one hand, Ireland experienced a long period of colonisation by England. Ireland has frequently been called England's first colony, and Irish people were highly racialised by the British state. On the other hand, some parts of Irish society were heavily implicated in the expansion of the British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries, with its attendant brutality, and in some cases were involved in slave trading. After the Act of Union of 1801, Ireland was formally part of the United Kingdom, although some colonial trappings were retained. Irish men served in the British Army and colonial administrations, and Irish people continued to migrate in large numbers to the Anglophone world. As such, whether Irish history can represent a decolonised curriculum is not a straightforward question. And we have joining us today a number of scholars grappling with the imperial and colonial legacies of Irish history to consider the challenges, opportunities, and sensitivities that a decolonising lens can bring to our work as historians. So just to set out how it's going to function, how it's going to work today, I will introduce each of our speakers in turn. They will each speak for 5 or 6 minutes on aspects of this theme, and then we'll open for questions. Whether you're joining us on Zoom or via YouTube, please do pose your questions in the comments, in the chat. They will be filtered through to me, and hopefully I will be able to put some of them to our panel. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our panel of speakers now. Our first speaker will be Professor Jane Ohlmeyer, who is the Erasmus Smith Professor of Modern History at Trinity College Dublin. Jane was Trinity's first Vice President for Global Relations. She was a driving force behind the 1641's Deposition Project and the development of Trinity's Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, which many of you will be familiar with. Since 2015, she has also been chair of the Irish Research Council. She is the author or editor of numerous books and articles, but just name a few recent ones, she edited volume 2 of the Cambridge History of Ireland and Clarendon's History of the Irish Civil Wars of the 1640s. She's currently working on a book on Ireland, Empire and the Early Modern World, which will be the basis of her Ford Lectures in Oxford in 2021. Thank you for joining us, Jane. Our second speaker will be Ian McBride, who is Foster Professor of Irish History at the University of Oxford. And he is the author of 18th Century Ireland, The Isle of Slaves from 2009, co-editor of the Princeton History of Modern Ireland from 2016, and is currently writing a book entitled The Secret History of Catholic Ireland, Persecution, Survival and the Penal Laws, 1695 to 1775. After Ian, we will be hearing from Dr. Laura Makatakni, who is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Aarhus University in Denmark. And Laura's research uses contemporary archaeology and critical heritage studies approaches to explore social justice issues in the past and their reverberations into the present. She has a particular interest in the material history of political imprisonment in Ireland. She's worked on Long Kesh Maze Prison and Kilmainham Jail, and also in post-conflict Northern Ireland, as well as gendered perspectives on the past and the experiences and memory of the colonial Caribbean. And she's currently working on a research project entitled Enduring Materialities of Colonialism, Temporality, Spatiality and Memory on St. Croix, which is one of the Danish former colonial territories. After Laura, we'll be hearing from Dr. Donal Hassett. Donal is a lecturer in the French department at the University of College Cork, specialising in colonial history. His first book is entitled Mobilising Memory, the Great War and the Language of Politics in Colonial Algeria, 1918 to 1939, and it appeared with OUP in 2019. And he's published widely on issues of memory and commemoration, is bringing an important comparative lens to our discussions today, and also is the current holder of an Irish Research Council New Foundations grant for a project on decolonising Irish public heritage. So again, many of the questions and the concerns and the issues I imagine that we would be speaking about today would also be relevant for Donal's other project. Next, we'll be hearing from Dr. Shamima Akhtar, who is a historian of race, migration and empire at Royal Holloway, University of London. She is currently working on a monograph exhibiting Irishness, Empire and Identity, 1851 to 1970, to be published with Manchester University Press. And her research looks at Ireland's display in World's Fairs of the 19th and 20th century in Britain and the United States, with a particular emphasis on questions of whiteness and of gender. Then we will be hearing from Timothy McMahon, who is an associate professor of history at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tim is also one of the past presidents of the American Conference of Irish Studies and will be familiar to many people in that capacity. Tim is a social historian with interests in nationalism and national identity, popular culture and empire. He's the author of Grand Opportunity, the Gaelic Revival in Irish Society from 2008, and recently edited with Michael Denny and Paul Townend a collection entitled Ireland in an Imperial World, Citizenship, Opportunism and Subversion. At present, Tim's working on a book about Irish partition and its impact on identities across the island. And our final speaker will be Kevin Kenny, who is Professor of History and Glucksman Professor in Irish Studies at New York University. Kevin works on the history of Irish emigration, American immigration, and global migration. His books include Making Sense of the Molly Maguires from 1998, The American Irish, from A History from 2000, Peaceable Kingdom Lost, The Paxton Boys and the Destruction of William Penn's Peaceable Kingdom, 2009, and Diaspora, A Very Short Introduction from 2013. He is also the editor of Ireland and the British Empire, which launched the Oxford History of the British Empire Companion Series in 2004. And he is currently working on a book about immigration policy and slavery in the United States from the American Revolution through to Reconstruction. And I'm sure questions around Irishness and Irish attitudes to those issues will be an important theme of that book as well. Okay, so I'll hand over to our first speaker. Each speaker will hand over to the next, and then we'll reconvene the panel and open up the floor for questions. So Jane, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe. Ireland was England's first colony. You've already said that. Yet if Ireland was colonial, it was also imperial. The Irish were both victims of imperialism as well as aggressive perpetrators of it, which of course poses particular challenges as we attempt to decolonise Irish history. So over the course of the next 5 minutes, I want to talk very briefly to 3 points. First, Ireland as England's first colony. Second, Ireland as laboratory for empire. And third, the Irish as colonists at home and abroad. So firstly then, Ireland as England's first colony. English imperialism in early modern Ireland was exploitative and driven by political, military, cultural, religious and economic concerns, and by the determination to colonise the island with English, Welsh and Scottish settlers. Yet some contemporaries, initially Old English Catholics and increasingly Protestants of Ireland, question this notion of colonial Ireland, preferring to focus on Ireland's status as a kingdom, first within a multiple monarchy and after the Act of Union of 1801 as an integral component of the British Empire. Now, certainly the Kingship Act of 1541, which declared Henry VIII King of Ireland and accorded the same rights as those of English to those of Irish origin, the same rights as those of English origin. It gave Ireland the constitutional status of a kingdom. However, in practice, I would argue Ireland was treated like a colony, and after the Act of Union continued to be treated as a colony, even if the Irish now did enjoy unprecedented access to imperial opportunities. So I'm very much of the Ireland as colony, and I'm sure that'll be a little bit controversial and others might want to take issue with that. My second point relates to the extent to which Ireland served as a laboratory for imperial rule and for resistance to that rule. I would argue that processes and practices of government, especially legal and landed ones, and others relating to Anglicisation, characterised from the mid-16th century, the implementation of English imperial authority in both Ireland and across the English Empire in the Atlantic, but also in early modern India. However, Ireland was much more than a laboratory. The recent work of David Brown has argued that Irish land, especially the 2.5 million acres that were expropriated during the 1650s, and the private enterprise that it spawned, funded English imperialism in Ireland and beyond. For many entrepreneurs, largely those based in London, these Irish landed interests simply formed part of a global portfolio of investments. And thus entrepreneurs like Maurice Thompson and his brothers hedged their bets by investing in the Atlantic colonies, where they would have invested in Virginian tobacco and Canadian fur, in the Caribbean, in slaves and sugar, in India, in textiles, and of course, in Ireland in land. The third point I want to touch on is the Irish, both Catholic and Protestant, and the role that they played as active imperialists, both at home, primarily as agents of Anglicisation and of commercialisation, but also across the early modern European empires. By 1660, Irish people, and mostly Irish men, were to be found in the French Caribbean, the Portuguese and later Dutch Amazon, Spanish Mexico, and of course the English colonies in the Atlantic and in Asia, especially in India, where these men mostly, they joined colonial settlements, they served as administrators, soldiers, and clergy, and forged commercial networks as they traded calicos, spices, tobacco, sugar, and slaves. These encounters shaped their sense of Irishness and, of course, how others represented them. And we can come back and discuss that. I want to make a final point, though, about how empire shaped Ireland, because the interconnectedness of the early modern world meant that the lives of those who remained in Ireland were shaped very much by interaction with these empires. So imperial commodities, food, drink, clothing, furnishings, shaped tastes, fashions, and landscapes, while representations of empire in novels, plays, prose, travel literature, and maps also fired imaginations, ideas, and mindsets. These are all issues that I'm going to be exploring in the forward lectures that Caoimhe mentioned. Happy to return to any of it in the discussion. I also would be happy to talk in the discussion about a new initiative in Trinity entitled Slavery, Imperialism and Racism, where we're actually drawing inspiration from how other universities, especially Glasgow and Oxford and Bristol, have engaged with their colonial and imperial legacies. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over now to Ian. Ian.
Okay, Jane, thank you. Decolonising history, I take to be the attempt to escape Eurocentric narratives and concepts that dominated and confined the writing of history in the 20th century, but also the attempt to rectify the structural blindness that enabled so many European historians to ignore the exploitation and violence and destruction caused by empire. What's different about the present moment, I think, is not really new ideas or new paradigms. It's the new sense of political urgency that's been created by contemporary racial prejudice. The scale and persistence of racial inequality has prompted claims that the entire Western liberal tradition has been structurally encoded right from the beginning to restrict full personhood to white Europeans and it's time that Irish historians contributed more fully to that debate. And when we turn to Ireland, of course, the idea of decolonising history divides into two. And that's because the Irish think of themselves, or they think of empire as something that was done to them, whereas historians increasingly think of empire as something that the Irish did to other peoples. The first part of that problem certainly applies to the 18th century, which is my period, and the era of the Protestant ascendancy and of the penal laws. Despite Daniel Corkery's 1924 classic, The Hidden Ireland, despite recent valuable work by Vincent Morley and Nessa Ní Namula, I think it's still true that 18th century historians begin with the state and its institutions, and that means above all the Parliament at College Green and the sources that were produced by those institutions. Catholics, the majority of the population, were often the subjects of that, of those sources, but very rarely their authors. Now, you would think one obvious source for decolonising Irish history then is Irish language material. The only thing I can say about that is that it seems to me the current generation of doctoral students are no more likely to use Irish language material, no better equipped to use it and incorporate its insights into the mainstream historiographical tradition. And I'd love to talk more about why that is. The other wider aspect of decolonising Irish history then means confronting Ireland's relationship with the extra-European world. And in my period, that means the extraordinary economic impact of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. This is the period when the economic growth of Belfast, Limerick, and especially Cork was stimulated by trade with the West Indies, and the richest inhabitants of Ireland's cities and towns were often directly involved in the slave trade. It's the era of Jonathan Swift, whose Gulliver's Travels in 1726 culminates in a spectacular denunciation of modern colonialism. It's the era of Edmund Burke's pursuit of Warren Hastings in the British House of Commons and his attempt to rectify what he saw as imperial misrule in India. Yet the careers of both Swift and Burke were entangled in transatlantic slavery. I've written about Swift and slavery in published and forthcoming work because Swift, of course, was the propagandist for the ministry that negotiated the Asiento, the contract to supply Spanish America with slaves. And it seems to me that literary critics, in their attempts to read Swift's Irish writings as covert critiques of the slave trade, provide a good example of decolonising history gone wrong. Burke's even more interesting, I think, as Peter Marshall has demonstrated in a strikingly original book published last year. Unlike Swift, Burke knew a lot about Britain's commercial and colonial expansion. He knew more about empire than anybody else since John Locke in the 1690s. Unlike Swift, we know that Burke thought empire was morally indefensible, and yet he subordinated his moral concerns to the priorities of British geopolitics and the interests of his numerous kinsmen who had political ambitions and financial interests in the Caribbean. The contrast between Burke's impassioned attack on imperial misrule in India and his evasions where the Caribbean is concerned is one reminder that colonialism was never a single or uniform thing, and the differentiation and attention to the specific political, economic, and intellectual dimensions of imperial struggles is an indispensable element of decolonising history. That's me, and my 5 minutes up. I'll now pass over to Laura Makatakni of OHUS.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm continuing Ian's points about the Caribbean. So my background, as Creva said, is in history, archaeology, and heritage. So that means that my focus is not solely on documentary evidence of the past and how we can use it to reconstruct what happened, but also on the material evidence more broadly and how the past reverberates, is used and understood at different points to the present. So my starting point in engaging with this question is to acknowledge that Ireland is an enduringly colonial space that has been deeply marked by colonialism, Ireland's experiences extend back centuries and have been shaped by wars, massacres, mass famines, forced diasporas, and partition. But we also need to acknowledge that alongside those experiences, the Irish also were beneficiaries of colonialism, as has been mentioned in the previous talks. For nearly a decade, I've worked with colleagues from the US on a survey archaeology project on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Montserrat has a particularly interesting history, as it's the only British colony that had a majority white population that came from Ireland. And this white population was made up of many sectors of Irish society, from planter to Gael, from plantocracy to indentured servant. So my focus was on making sense of those colonial records. It quickly became apparent they were fragmented, scattered, and problematic in terms of what was recorded and survived. It also meant acknowledging that these were records of control, exploitation, and extraction. They were not made to provide rounded histories, and nor would they be able to do so. They reveal the Irish experience of colonialism on the island ranged dramatically from being victims to beneficiaries to anything in between. And often that changed. People sometimes benefited a lot from empire and then it was taken away from them at other times. The colonial world was brutal, unforgiving, and oppressive, but it allowed for opportunism. Many soldiers made their fortunes and names in such places, whereas women fortunate enough to outlive their male relatives could take on their roles and responsibilities much easier than they could in Ireland. Some colonial experiences were easier to locate than others. The most hidden figures for me were trying to find stories of the early indentured white servants. They could be glimpsed at from laws attempting to control their activities, as they were feared as potential rebels, and also sometimes their courtroom appearances, but they were never really there on their own terms. The records mainly focused on land and its transfer. The wills of planters revealed white fathers sometimes recognized and provided for their children with enslaved women, and favored enslaved people were sometimes freed on a planter's death, but more often enslaved people were named in lists that dealt with them as commodities. These documents revealed the real differences in how white indentured servants and black enslaved people experienced colonialism, which has been a kind of focus of debate in recent past. Over time, I realized that the Irish experiences of colonialism were not simply a white experience. As well as exploiting enslaved Africans, they forged alliances, relationships, and connections. They left behind an ambiguous and ambivalent legacy that needs to be incorporated into wider stories of Irishness and their experiences of different colonies. And as has already been noted, this is not just the British Empire. It became clear that official archives were insufficient and unsatisfactory in exploring this Irish experience. Rather, working with material remains and their enduring impact provided broader insights. This included surveying abandoned plantations in the north of Montserrat that revealed how they were organized and developed over time until their abandonment, often quite even in periods before emancipation, because Montserrat had fallen out of favor a long time before then. We excavated sites that left no historic traces in the archives, including post-emancipation school buildings on forgotten hillsides. And we explored the seemingly strong affinity between Montserrat and an Irish identity. For the latter point, surprises arose from analysis of newspapers that revealed the deliberate readoption of an Irish identity in the late 1960s to early 1980s, at a time when left-leaning public intellectuals on the island were inspired by the post-colonial aspirations of their neighbours. Montserrat was and remains a British colony. It is unable to economically detach itself from Britain, but it did have aspirations. Newspaper articles were used to educate the populace as to the oppression of their enslaved ancestors by white planters, including the Irish. But this act of education was only partially successful. The island adopted St. Patrick's Day in the early 1980s as a national holiday, and over time it lost its strong connections to remembering an historic slave rebellion on the same day in 1768. By the mid-1980s, it was being used to advertise Montserrat to Irish Americans as a holiday destination. And it is now used as a time for diasporic exiles to return to the island post-volcanic eruptions of the 1990s. Colonialism continues to haunt these spaces in various ways, but it reveals that the Irish colonial experience was not just as victim nor simply a white experience. These complexities deserve inclusion in our attempts to decolonize Irish history. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Donal.
Thanks very much, Laura. So as someone who comes from outside the field of Irish history and has done most of my research and training outside of these islands, I think it's important to point out the opportunity Ireland's complex past offers us to be leaders in Europe on the question of decolonisation of history and the humanities more broadly. The limited appeal of narratives that seek to rehabilitate the colonial project here means that there may be a broader cultural space for a nuanced discussion around Ireland's experience of colonialism and the participation of parts of Irish society in empire overseas. We should not simply import wholesale the frames of analysis that have been deployed in the US, France, and Britain, shaped by different histories and different political and cultural imperatives, but rather use this opportunity to open a broader discussion about Ireland's colonial pasts and their legacies in contemporary Irish history, heritage, and society. So turning specifically to the discipline of history, I want to suggest that one of the key ways we can reimagine Irish history through a decolonial lens is to more frequently and consistently look beyond the Anglophone sphere and to think of Ireland's history in comparison to and entangled with the other imperial projects that have shaped the modern world. Quite understandably, analysis of Ireland's status as a colony and of Irish involvement in overseas colonialism has tended to focus primarily on the British Empire, but I would echo my colleagues who have just spoken in arguing that much can be learned from the examples, for example, from comparing Ireland to other settler colonies in the French and Portuguese empires, from expanding our knowledge of Irish involvement in Spanish colonialism and in the French slave trade, and from thinking about our revolutionary period in the same framework as the more or less contemporaneous Rif Rebellion in Morocco, or subsequent struggles in Algeria and Angola. And here we may have more to learn from the differences between these cases in Ireland than the similarities, but the comparisons, I argue, are very much worth making. And this will, of course, require an embrace of multilingualism that's not just confined to European languages, but would also include actively encouraging students of Irish history to develop, where possible, skills in African, Asian, and other languages. And this should go hand in hand with a broader diversification of the voices we hear in the classroom and in public discourse around Irish history, something that would enhance the cultural and linguistic perspectives informing our understanding of the past and help us build a global and decolonised vision of Irish history. It would also help counter one of the features of classic narratives of Irish history that I think is most problematic. That is the tendency to project other colonial spaces as simply the background against which Irish and British histories are played out. So we see this in some of the more simplistic discussions of the South African War, presented as a clash between the Boers and Irish nationalists on the one side and British and Irish loyalists on the other, with little to no acknowledgement of the thousands of Africans caught up in the conflict. Might it be more useful for us, for example, to think of Irish nationalist involvement in the conflict, and indeed in events like the Fenian Raid in Canada, as anti-imperial but not anti-colonial, in that they did not seek to undo the logics of European supremacy in these territories? Likewise, the Belgian Congo appears as a backdrop to Roger Casement's heroic exposure of the crimes of colonialism and his conversion to anti-imperialism in a narrative that erases the agency of the Congolese themselves and that sometimes unproblematically reproduces the white savior trope that was used to legitimize European rule in Africa in the first place. So we have seen some real progress on this. Only this morning I noticed there was an event organised by the Irish Embassy in India on the Connacht Rangers mutiny of 1920 and bringing together Irish and Indian experts to discuss the entangled history of the two territories in the post-World War I period. So this is one way we can begin to decolonise Irish history, by foregrounding the other histories of the spaces in which the stories we tell about Ireland and the Irish played out. So finally, I want to finish with a plea for historians of Ireland to follow the example set by our colleagues in literary studies, and I would say that as somebody based in a language department, to engage more fully with the theory and the historiography emerging from the global south. So I don't mean that all Irish historians need to embrace Fanon, Spivak, Wationgo, or Mbembe any more than all historians need to embrace Edmund Burke, Karl Marx, or Judith Butler. I'm just saying that we should acknowledge the import of these theories and be in a position to say why we are embracing or rejecting them in our analyses of Ireland's past. Of course, the Global South is not just a locus of production of theory, it's also a site of the production of contemporary historical knowledge. Scholars from the Global South are often frozen out of the networks of knowledge production and sharing that are dominated by European and North American academies. The new reality of online conferencing offers an opportunity to engage much more thoroughly with scholars in these countries, and that has the potential to be mutually beneficial and also to undo some of the colonial logics that continue to shape academia. Only recently I was talking to a very enthusiastic postgrad in Sousse in Tunisia who is writing about Ireland in his pieces. I think it's important that we do our best to make people like him feel part of the Irish history community too. So thank you for your time. I look forward to the general discussion, and I'll now hand over to my colleague, Shamima Akhtar.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin by reflecting on the makeup of the Historical Academy in terms of staff and students, and who actually gets to write history before thinking about how you can decolonise Irish history. So in October 2018, the Royal Historical Society, where I was formerly a postdoc, published a report on race, ethnicity and equality in UK history. And the current past and present postdoctoral fellow working with RHS is now Dr. Dia Gupta. So this report surveyed the state of the discipline for BME staff and students in particular. And some key findings of the report include that history is the 5th least diverse subject in UK universities in terms of race and ethnicity. Generally, the report found that undergraduate level history was overwhelmingly white in terms of students, but the numbers were even lower when it came to postgraduate level history, and unsurprisingly, that history academic staff are less diverse than history and philosophy student cohorts, with 94% of history staff drawn from white backgrounds and only 0.5 Black, 2.2 Asian and 1.6% mixed. So the report identified that curriculum content from secondary school level to university history stratified interest in history amongst BME students. It offered statistical data on the endemic experience of discrimination, bias and harassment suffered by BME staff and students, typically by their colleagues and their peers. And the report ended with recommending changes that address the leaky pipeline issue, which refers to kind of progression from school to A-level to undergraduate and postgraduate level history in the form of dedicated funding under the remit of positive action, the need to expand the history curriculum throughout all stages, and specific anti-racist and unconscious bias training. So with the landscape such as it is, how do we write decolonial histories at all, and specifically of Ireland? So cultural theorist Stuart Hall notes, race is a cultural and historical, not a biological fact. Race is a discursive construct, a sliding signifier. So we know that race is one of the great classificatory systems of difference that operate in human societies, and it is the centre of a hierarchical system that produces difference both historically and in the present. So to describe race as a shifting category that is culturally constructed is not to deny that race is an operative category of power in British and Irish society that has tangible real-world effects. It is important for anyone working on or writing decolonial histories or thinking about equality, diversity and inclusivity programs to understand how race as a category has been culturally and historically constructed at the forefront of our intellectual interventions, to enable us to question the assumptions and structural positions that have bolstered racial inequity within the historical academy specifically and society more broadly. So in my own research, as was mentioned, I look at Irish exhibitions in world fairs in the 19th and 20th centuries in Britain and the United States. As part of this, I take key studies of Ireland's display and map it onto notable moments in Irish history, whether the post-famine movement, the peak of Irish migration to the US in the 1890s, the Home Rule debate in the early 20th century, and the interwar period, as well as partition politics. In my archival research, I found sources related to a specific Irish village called Ballymaclinton. This was exhibited over 17 years from the 1907 Irish Industrial Exhibition in Dublin to the 1924 British Empire Exhibition. The owners of the fair were two Irish entrepreneurs whose names were David and Robert Brown, and they owned a soap company in Donegal, County Tyrone, and they used the village of Ballymaclinton as a way to advertise these soaps. They built a replica village of they built a replica version of an Irish village in the heart of London, and even employed 250 Irish women and 50 young men to populate the village and live in it for 6 months at a time. So I'm in the process at the moment of writing a book on this research, and I have recently published a piece for History Workshop Online if you are interested in hearing more about this village. And there's incredible kind of pictures, postcards, photographs from the exhibition itself. So in the display, Irish women used the soap publicly and performatively, and it became part of the general narrative in British soap advertisements that one could become white by using British soaps. And there's incredible kind of images online where, so for instance, a black child is put in a bathtub and uses pear soaps and comes out half white. So this is kind of a broader context. So in the Irish case, the conceit of soap consumption was that the Irish could become more white coded as becoming civilized and more British. And the two brothers were Protestant Unionist sympathizers, and they felt the success of their soap company relied on British capital and were very clear about their hopes of presenting an ideal utopian Ireland ripe for investment. So by using an analysis of race and gender, I uncover how the Irish laboured for whiteness in the early 20th century as a way to combat the general negative prejudices popular in British discourse in this period, particularly during the Home Rule debate, where Simeon-like portrayals of Irish men presented the country as backward, underdeveloped, and violent. The exhibited women, on the other hand, were peaceful, beautiful, and inviting. As an example of how you can decolonize Irish history, this case study reveals how you can tell familiar stories, whether of display and exhibitions, but read through the lens of whiteness and femininity, they can tell us a different story about spectacle acting as a site of resistance or else assimilation for certain Irish contemporaries. So to wrap up, on a dual level, we need to reform the Historical Academy in terms of the makeup of staff and students, and also change the questions we ask. And this is not to say that we can only research from our own positionality, but is of course the case that the questions we ask of our historical subjects are rooted from our own subjectivities. Whilst the meaning of decolonizing has multiple interpretations, the term certainly includes pedagogies that make visible the structures of colonial authority and colonial thinking that have shaped society, and in the case of the Irish, allows us to investigate how those ties came to be made and unmade. Thank you, and I'd like to hand over to Tim now.
Thank you, Shamima. The baton is going to be picked up right where you left off, I think. Colonization is a process that takes effect over time, that shapes the minds as well as the spaces within which people live. So it should not be surprising that decolonization is also a process that occurs fitfully over time. How then do historians, as cultural commentators, whose lived experiences are shaped within the mindsets and spaces created by prior generations, do our work and read our sources in ways that approach the past with due consideration for colonial legacies that we don't even recognize in ourselves? Such questions informed a book I co-edited with Michael Denis and Paul Townend, Ireland in an Imperial World, Citizenship, Opportunism, and Subversion. Focusing on the 19th and 20th centuries, we noted, as others today already have, that Ireland was simultaneously colonized and colonizer, an anti-colonial space and anti-colonial beacon, while also training police who would enforce law and order in colonies from Trinidad to Singapore. No one embodied that liminal attitude better for me than William H.K. Redmond, MP, Home Rule politician, member of the Wexford Militia, and brother of the Irish Party leader John Redmond. He was a staunch advocate for tenants' rights, whose agrarian radicalism landed him in jail on 3 occasions, and whose fierce opposition to the Boer War led to his expulsion from the House of Commons in 1899. And yet, like so many politicians of his generation, he traveled through the Irish diaspora in the USA and in the White Dominions, raising money for the party and praising the part that the Irish played in shaping the world at that moment. On visiting Australia, for example, just after the creation of the new Commonwealth, he reflected on what he saw, and especially on the death of a former teacher from Clongowes Wood, the Reverend Joseph Dalton, SJ, who had joined the Irish Jesuit mission to Australia and helped to found the new state's 2 most distinguished Catholic secondary schools. Dalton's life and death were emblematic of the thousands of Irishmen and Irish women who lived in voluntary exile to spread the faith and influence of Ireland. Redmond concluded, were her borders to be measured by the lands where the ashes of her children mingle with the earth, then indeed would the limits of the whole world be her frontiers. Almost as if he's speaking to the Royal Colonial Institute, right? None of which discounts the staunch anti-imperialism of nonviolent and violent actors alike in the Irish tradition. Instead, I bring this up to underscore that while Nehru of India and Nkrumah of Ghana and Ek Tayan of Korea could point to De Valera and other Irish actors as inspiration, so too must we recognize that Irish actors were still policing the Palestine Mandate into the 1940s, advising on legal policy in Cyprus into the 1950s, and working tirelessly in missionary schools and hospitals in service to a spiritual empire that had taken root under the umbrella of the British Empire and the intellectual stimulus of social Darwinism. Closer to home, within Ireland itself, unthinking imperial legacies abound. I'll mention two which are related to recent headlines, but whose colonial connections are too often overlooked. First, educational institutions. Across Ireland, in the Republic and in Northern Ireland, the clergy have played a vital role in education. It would be easy to think of the religious influence in publicly funded institutions in the Republic, in particular, as a creation of the Free State era. But of course, the national schools were founded by the United Kingdom in the 1830s as Anglicizing agencies. They were nominally non-sectarian, but de facto segregated by religion and managed by the clergy. In other words, the now less than comfortable relationship between state and church entities were rooted in the United Kingdom's reliance on indirect rule through local elites, that is, the clergy. Does such a recognition play any part in determining how schools are governed in an increasingly secular republic, or how that republic manages data on abuses carried out in church-run but state-supported institutions? Second, partition. Coming up on its centenary. I commend to you Thomas Jones's Whitehall Diary for the cabinet discussions of policy during the Irish War of Independence and the parallel progress of the Government of Ireland Act of 1920. To be sure, the determination to partition the island was motivated primarily by domestic concerns, but with uncertainties in a variety of imperial theaters happening concurrently, discussions about the use of coercion, the progress of legislation, and the specific division of the island included references to Amritsar, to the Dominions, and to the lack of a bota among the Sinn Féin leadership. In the event, then, the division of the island was shaped by imperial uncertainties for the British leaders as much as it was by different attitudes toward imperial connections among Unionists and nationalists within Ireland. How, if at all, might that recast how we think about the impending centenaries in the next months and years? Reconciling, or at least being mindful of these disparate, even contradictory realities, it seems to me, will be important to understand more fully the experiences of prior generations in Ireland. Certainly, we as researchers need to be cognizant of them as we interrogate our sources, and we miss entire swaths of references in the press, in government documents, and in personal papers that are essential to the work of decolonizing Irish history. If we don't see it, if we don't write it, the embedded colonial remains uncontested. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it on to Kevin.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you to Caoimhe and Ian for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I had no idea when I received the invitation what this term decolonisation might mean, honestly, as somebody working in 19th century American history. So the advantage of going last is I've learned many of the things that it might mean, and the disadvantage is that I've discovered that my presentation is all wrong, but I'll give it anyway. I haven't done much editing. So actually, you know, what I thought I would do when I got this invitation was, firstly, I thought about it and I said, well, there's a neutral sense in which I can use this term decolonisation, which is simply to signify the process through which a body of knowledge, in this case, a form of historical understanding, might be liberated from received wisdom and reconstituted on new terms. So in a neutral or generic sense, decolonisation could mean that. But because the historical example I will be discussing has to do with the racial status of the Irish abroad, I think my remarks also have some bearing on our understanding of the literal colonisation of Ireland, at least insofar as the subordinate status of the Irish at home is thought to have implications for their condition abroad, or for perceptions of the Irish abroad. So I'm going to touch on the category of whiteness, as Shamima did, and offer a slightly different take based on the US case. So when I completed my doctoral training 25 years ago, the whiteness thesis had just emerged within US labor historiography as a potential master concept for interpreting Irish American history. And according to the whiteness thesis, The Irish were not initially regarded as white in the United States. They became so by distancing themselves from blacks, by exerting their agency to acquire a new racial identity. And I had written a dissertation about transatlantic Irish labor history. And as I was preparing that for publication, I said, well, okay, do I have to recast it as a study of whiteness? I chose not to at the time for a number of reasons. Really, as a labor historian, seeking to explain the position of the Irish in 19th century America, I felt that the analytical tools already at my disposal, class conflict and religious prejudice, were adequate to the task. And I'll return to that point in my conclusion. But around the year 2000, shortly after I had published the book, several US historians began to call for a moratorium on the whiteness debate, even as the concept was colonizing other subfields and other national historiographies. They did so in fairly harsh terms. To pose the question of how the Irish became white presupposed that they were not white to begin with, that they set out to acquire that racial status, and that they eventually did so. In other words, experiencing racism was the necessary precondition of becoming white. To say that the American Irish were initially seen as less than white was to say that they were consigned to an inferior race. But the question then posed by these historians was, well, to what race had the Irish supposedly been consigned? They could enter the country freely, settle where they wished, move around, become citizens, exercise the vote, and take legal suits. Most African Americans, subject to a one-drop rule classifying them as black on the basis of their ancestry, could do none of these things. And so in that context, African American history and chattel slavery provide the benchmarks for defining race in 19th century America. And race, seen from this perspective, carries no benefits or advantages. In its historical origins, it is imposed, not chosen. It is not an identity willingly acquired, but a forceful attempt to negate identity. So in 19th century America, it's hard to see how much analytical meaning the term race can retain if it's used as an umbrella term to describe both the ownership of people of African ancestry and the prejudice encountered by European immigrants. So that's what the debate, the argument against whiteness was about. I would say that whiteness as deployed in British scholarship is significantly different in ways that we could discuss. Three ways that occur to me are chronological. I think it's a later period that most of the British scholarship deals with, late 19th and 20th century. I think empire, as distinct from domestic chattel slavery, introduces a critical difference. And I think I'm not sure, the approach may have more to do with classification of the Irish rather than their pursuit of a putative racial identity. But again, Shamima's presentation runs a bit counter to that as well. Overall, the research I'm doing would indicate that 19th century America was a good place to be a foreigner, provided you came from Europe. Foreign versus native birth was much less important in determining civil and political privilege than classification by race. Euro-Americans, including the Irish, enjoyed all sorts of rights and privileges that were denied to people born on the soil, especially African Americans. So in that sense, the Irish stood firmly on the right side of the color line from the beginning. So that leaves me with one final point, which is, in light of that, then how are we to describe the status of the Irish in 19th century America? It is no part of my agenda today to deny that the Irish encountered prejudice. But one of the things that I'm doing in my research, and other historians are doing in similar ways these days, is to consider anti-immigrant nativism not only as a body of bigoted ideas, not only as a matter of cultural representation, it is both of those things, but also for its practical impact at the concrete level of laws and policies. So you could pose the question, what difference did nativist hostility make to how the Irish live their lives? And a number of us are doing work along those lines that to the extent that anti-Irish nativism was embodied in laws and policies, we can examine state-level regulation of immigration, we can examine proposals concerning naturalization and disenfranchisement, we can examine a number of other measures I'd be happy to discuss today. And obviously, beyond formal law and policy, the Irish endured plenty of social, cultural, and religious prejudice. The question then is whether the category of race in the form of whiteness is helpful or necessary in explaining that prejudice. So thank you. And I'm turning back now to Caoimhe and Nick to moderate. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to all our speakers for a set of very rich presentations with lots of nice echoes and resonances and baton passing from between one and the other, and with lots of food for discussion and for further thought. As I mentioned, we have about 40 minutes or so left for discussion and questions. So please, members of the audience, please do send through your questions via chat, either on Zoom or on YouTube. The first question that I'd like to put to the panel is to maybe ask us all to reflect as historians or as historical archaeologists, in the case of Laura, as to why do you think Irish historians have been so comparatively reluctant to engage with questions around Ireland as a colony in the modern period? I know that historians of the early modern period, I mean, clearly there are there's much more straightforward questions to be tackled there. But speaking as a historian of modern Ireland, I've been struck by how much more comfortable our colleagues in literary studies are, and in Irish studies more generally, in engaging with questions around colonialism and in particular Ireland as a post-colonial entity. And by comparison, it seems to me modern Irish historians, as Ian has said, have been more comfortable with looking at Ireland's participation in empire and the British expansion overseas than in understanding Ireland's position as a semi-colonial entity in the 20th century and as a post-colonial entity into the 21st. So I wonder, could I ask Ian first to give us your thoughts on that one?
Oh, yes. Thanks, Caoimhe. So there has been some work on colonialism in Irish history, but it does tend to come from outsiders. So, I mean, one of the unusual candidates, I suppose, is Cruz OBrien, whose States of Ireland in 1972 actually had a colonial framework for understanding the Irish problem and was, of course, in his background, familiar with colonial writing. Joseph Ruan from sociology and anthropology wrote about colonialism in Ireland. And then the political scientists often discussed the question of Ireland being a colony, but from a Marxist standpoint. So, I mean, we've forgotten some of the ways in which we used to talk about colonialism, is my point. It's completely true, though, that the first person to write about colonialism in Irish history in the more sort of modern sense was Stephen Howe, who's not an Irish historian. And this is an example, I suppose, of the reluctance of Irish historians to theorize generally. Just say two very quick things. I mean, one explanation for this is that we took our historiographical models from England, from the Institute of Historical Research in London and from the University of Cambridge. And so for a lot of the 20th century, we thought that doing history meant studying Parliament and political parties and constitutions. And then when we became social historians, we took our model from E.P. Thompson or Eric Hobsbawm, and we thought it was about redressor movements. That's one thing. The other point I make very quickly is that when post-colonialism appeared in the 1980s, it was unhelpfully framed as an attack on historical writing. And it took, and the background was the rise of Sinn Féin in the north and the IRA struggle. And in that context, the debate was intensely heated for political reasons. And that's no longer the case.
Yeah, and thinking about Cruz OBrien in that context is all the more surprising, given that he's, as you say, he writes about Algeria, I think in particular, understands Ireland as in some way analogous to the Algerian case. And of course, we all know he would not have been sympathetic to the Sinn Féin interpretation of Irish history, far from it. Jane, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect on the same question. As a scholar of early modern Ireland, do you see differences in the way historians of that earlier period, as compared to historians of the modern period, approach the question of colonialism, post-coloniality, and those legacies?
Absolutely, I do, Quiva. And I don't want to repeat what Ian said, because I would agree with what he's just said. I would just like to develop maybe, I think the elephant in the room here, of course, was the Troubles. And the reality was that it just was touching a very raw nerve, because there are communities still, of course, very much in the north of Ireland particularly, who don't want to accept, if you want, that Ireland was ever a colony, and won't accept that it, the whole decolonial argument either. I was very struck by a colleague at Queen's, Audrey Horning's book, which looks, and I know Laura, you might want to get in here too, that, she won't even acknowledge the fact that Ireland was a colony in the early modern period, when the evidence is absolutely unequivocal, because she didn't want to give offence to that loyalist community in the north. Now, to my mind, we're actually, we're distorting what, in terms of the empirical evidence here, if we're letting these issues cloud our thinking. And thank goodness we've all moved on. And I think actually the fact that we're in this reflective moment in Ireland, and I think the decade of commemorations has been extremely important in, if you want, liberating us of that legacy of the Troubles, where, and I know, just let me point about the Troubles, then point about the decade of commemorations. I've been very interested in Field Day, and of course Field Day was represented as the literary wing of the IRA, simply because a lot of Brian Friel's work, never mind other writers associated with Field Day, were actually trying to engage with this imperial colonial legacy in the 1980s, when it was just, it was like touching a raw nerve. Fast forward to today, I think it's a very different situation. I think the way that we have negotiated these very sensitive moments, the First World War, and obviously 1916 has been extremely liberating in terms of how we're able to engage with our legacy and with colonialism. Although I must say I was extremely struck. We had the anniversary of the Amritsar massacre. And it was very interesting when that was discussed on Irish radio. People didn't even realize that both the commanding officer and the man in charge of the Punjab at the time were either educated in Ireland or from Tipperary, an Irish Catholic from Tipperary. And so on the one hand, and it goes back to something Ian said at the Ireland, either we're ignorant of it, or we don't want to have to engage with the fact that, of course, Irish Catholics as well as Irish Protestants were extremely active in empire. Final point I just want to say is, picking up what Donal was saying, the importance of looking at all of this in a much more comparative way. I think that that's also going to allow, if you want, contemporary historians to look at Ireland and this colonial legacy in a much healthier way as well. In other words, we're no longer going to be ostriches about this. We're actually going to engage with the evidence. So that's my take on it all.
Thanks. I'm going to bring in Tim and then Kevin. So Tim.
Thanks. Can you all hear me? I know my signal was a little broken up earlier. So I think another thing that we have to keep in mind is that as Irish historians were developing the historiography in the 20th century, so much of it was still built on, I don't want to say a teleology, but a narrative of how they came to be an independent state, if you will, and that it's in challenging that straight line narrative, or mostly straight line narrative that I think we start to get into discussions of A, Irish participation in the building and management of empire, and B, the implications of that in terms of decolonizing. You know, it's Jane, you bring up O'Dwyer there at Amritsar is really very interesting to me, because, you know, like on the eve of the First World War, when Home Rule was about to be passed, there was a conference on what a Home Rule Ireland would look like at Clongowes Wood. And one of the things that was stated there was a reminder that he was an alum of Clongowes Wood, that O'Dwyer was, and with men like O'Dwyer out there, we can manage ourselves very well. And yet here 5 years later, he's you know, the leader of the Punjab at that moment. So how does one think in these terms? How does one reconcile the fact that the Irish were racialized in a particular way, and yet we're also trying to reconfigure that so they could racialize non-white peoples in the empire and see themselves as somehow superior? These are questions that I think are uncomfortably overlooked and have been for too long. So I think partly we're building from our colleagues in other disciplines and becoming better readers, frankly.
So I just wanted to add a comment on the difficulty of putting my own field, which is Irish emigration, into a colonial framework in line with the original question. So when I teach the subject, and I'll be teaching the 300-year period from 1700 to the present, the starting assumption, and it's a reasonable one, by the students, will be that this is a process that got underway in 1845. And so we'll say, well, actually the syllabus is covering a longer period. So we'll see that even if we start after Jane's period slightly in 1700, we're going to see that 10 million people left the island, and that 2 million of them left in the decade after the famine. The famine lays down a template for the pre-understanding, if you like, of Irish emigration as a whole. And if we're looking at the 19th century, there'll be lots of disputes on whether we can describe Irish history in a colonial framework, and we can talk all about that. But in terms of the connection between Ireland and the British Empire, you can construct an argument, and that argument, because of the intensity of what happens for one decade, then can overshadow the whole. So if you step back from that and you work with the students and you say, okay, there were 4 times as many people in the 150 years before and after that cataclysmic event. How will we describe that? And we look at the early 19th century and we say, okay, most people are migrating for the same reason that most people migrate. There are fundamental economic reasons why they're leaving. Then we come up with a different narrative. If we wanted to connect that to Ireland's colonial history, we would need a knowledge of the 17th and 18th century to even begin to understand the distribution of land and the inequity in the system. So it's a fascinating question to me, because the presupposition is that colonialism is behind this, but the understanding of what that might mean takes a lot of hard work.
There's lots of questions coming in, both on the model format that we have and the particular clustering around the questions around language, which some of our speakers flagged presentations. There's a few issues to unpick here, of course. The first is the ability of scholars to access sources in the Irish language in particular, is what we're talking about here. And whether not having that ability is contradictory with aiming for a sort of a decolonised history. The second question is around the language that we write in. We all, pretty much, well, apart from Tim, who has published in the Irish language, of course, but everyone else publishes in the English language particularly. So what implications does that have for how we are reproducing some of the assumptions around English as the dominant language in and of Irish history? So Donal, as a colleague who works in a language department, I wonder, could I ask you to give your impressions of how those difficult questions around language and sources, what they look like to you as somebody who's coming at it from an adjacent field?
I should also fess up that I am somebody who works on a territory in which French is the imposed colonial language, but there are other languages, notably Arabic. I'm someone who's been struggling through learning Arabic and wrote my first piece using an Arabic source this year. So I'm completely sympathetic to the idea that Irish students, of history struggle with or choose not to invest the time in learning the Irish language. But I do think it's something, again, that we need to be at least honest about, and that, when we write as scholars of Ireland, we need to address, if we are not writing using sources in the Irish language or writing in Irish, why that is the case and what that might take from our work. And then we need to think more deeply about the structural issues that are connected to that. So there is a structural issue around the teaching of Irish in Ireland, which is to do with questions of prestige. And, there's a whole complex issue around that we need to acknowledge. But there's also a broader problem, particularly serious in the UK, around the teaching of languages in general and the decline of languages. So we're talking about history graduates, particularly in the UK, that are emerging not with Irish, but not with French, they're just emerging primarily with English. And then the final thing that we need to take into consideration is, again, the diversity of students and staff that we're recruiting. So, Galway have been quite successful in trying to target students from the Gaeltacht who can then study history in Irish at NUIG. But we should see that as parallel to efforts in the UK and in Ireland to try and get students with heritage languages to take history and to get interested in Irish history. So why not try and also get students from, Bengali or Punjabi backgrounds interested in Irish history, and they could use those language skills. So we should think of Irish as a language in a similar way that we think of other languages of formerly colonized territories, and try to have a proactive approach in integrating it into our historical research.
Ian, you mentioned that you might want to reflect on this. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, yes. I would also lament the inability of historians to speak and write in other languages. I say other languages because my research in recent years has been in Roman archives, and there are more than 50 archives in Rome with Irish material, and some of them have many thousands of documents on Ireland. They're predominantly in Italian, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in French. Interestingly, not a word of Irish that I've found so far, but perhaps I will find some. I mean, I don't know why this problem is so entrenched. It's got something to do with the way that universities had history departments and Irish language departments that were completely separate in Ireland from the 1920s. But I don't know why it persists as severely as it does. One of the problems, I think, is that the Irish language material from my period, the 18th century, has got problems of interpretation, that it's predominantly in the form of poetry, and historians are very bad at theorizing what literary genre material in the literary genre might contribute to one's understanding of public opinion and how far it matters, or how far it should be dismissed as idle pub talk, as Louis Cullen has said. I think that's a serious issue. I mean, to me, to have a bilingual, as it were, history of 18th century Ireland, where you could fully incorporate insights from Irish language sources, would be a fantastic thing, but also rely on the Irish language scholars abandoning their fixation with Jacobitism and with high politics, and trying to show how Irish language material can illuminate attitudes to masculinity, femininity, popular medicine, popular superstition, all those sorts of things.
Jane, you wanted to come in next.
I need to just say that, I agree with what's been said. There's an awful lot available in translation as well, especially for the early modern bardic poetry. There are vernacular texts as well. So to my mind, there's no excuse for people not at least engaging with the material available in translation. I would have, and I look at the work of particularly the literary scholars, Claire Carroll's Circe's Cup, and the way that she has used the Irish language material there to comment on exactly these sorts of issues. And it's just fabulous. I want to make another point though. The work that I did on Ireland and India, I was hugely conscious of the, if you want, the linguistic bias, and the records of the East India Company, of course, are all in English, and was very conscious that there was a very rich vein of material in Lisbon that was in Portuguese. But I was also trying to pick into, the indigenous languages. And while I had a researcher busy for me in Lisbon, I also then I was teaching at JNU in Delhi at the time, and was very lucky to have graduate students who were doing work in the archives in Surat, and to a lesser extent, the Parsi archive in Mumbai. But there was just simply nothing there for this early period. So sadly, the only written records that we had were the ones either in Portuguese or in English. And that was as frustrating for them when they went looking as it was for me. But what we did have was a lot of material culture in terms of the textiles, but also in terms of some of the physical remains. Now, they're not in great shape in India, but at least they're still there. And that takes us, of course, back to some of the fabulous points that Laura was making. So all I'm trying to say is, in addition to the written texts, the literary texts, the visual and cultural and actual vernacular buildings are so important as well. And some of the funeral monuments, there's a very rich physical legacy that we can never ignore.
I'm going to bring in Tim briefly on the language question before we move on. We've got lots of topics to cover. So Tim.
So just very briefly, one of the challenges that I faced as a doctoral student from the US, learning the language here, was first of all finding people who had the language, and second of all, getting up to a level where I could read in a meaningful way. I would never claim to be expert enough to write sophisticated work in Irish. I'm not there. What I would say though is that I encountered both among American-based scholars and Irish-based scholars the question of whether it was even necessary to have Irish, which struck me as really strange, particularly since I was working on a language revival. But I think that what Jane just said about coming at issues from a variety of angles, material, anthropological study, about practice, how people actually engage in their daily lives. These are things that, again, historians haven't always incorporated into their work. And so I think part of what we need to do is to think about ways into material, whether we have the language skills or not.
Laura, are you raising your hand? No. I thought Laura, you are raising your hand. Come in there, please.
So just very quickly, and it was just to add on to what Jane had said about the material culture. And again, if we're trying to look at lived experiences of Irishness through different empires, different places and times, we need to incorporate these different sources. But I think it's really important that historians engage with archaeology and how we do that, that it's not just here's stuff and we'll just go and use it and then it'll tell us all these things. That text and objects and buildings all tell completely different stories, and they can contradict each other as well as reinforce. And I really love having conversations with historians, because I think we can get more meaningful ways to actually have those kind of discussions, and particularly talk about things like the impact of these materials, like that they persist, like somewhere like Dublin, which is an imperial city with all these imperial signatures, you know, how does that affect people living there now who come from ex-colonies? And, you know, different engagements with all those spaces I think are actually quite important things to think about. It's not just an intellectual exercise.
Absolutely, and this brings up another theme that I wanted to explore, which was a question which is reflected in a question posed by Kevin O'Sullivan from NUI Galway, which is to ask the panel to reflect on what the impact of increased immigration to Ireland over the last 20 years will be for what Irish history is, how Irish history understands itself, and especially what the Irish historical profession looks like. Shamima, I know you have worked on this explicitly in relation to history in the UK and in Britain, most particularly of all. But do you see, from your perspective, do you see a similar kind of process playing out in Ireland, perhaps over the next, hopefully this might be the beginning of some of these conversations about how we begin to transform our curricula, how we begin to change our profession to make it more inclusive, to make it more representative of the diverse Ireland that we have today? I wonder, could you speak to that?
I think that it's difficult trying to not infer kind of a teleology and a positive one at that, which is that this is the start of kind of conversations that are happening, but particularly kind of drawing on what happened in the UK. It was, as you said in your sort of opening comments, a recognition of broader kind of political urgency and that contemporary concern that really drove efforts to decolonize the curriculum. And it was always student-led. So the Roads Must Fall campaign, the kind of decolonizing the curriculum, Why is my professor so white? These were all student-led initiatives. And it'd be great if something kind of similar or of an equivalence would happen in Ireland. But of course, that's not to kind of try and map out the future. But I think that in any kind of consideration of what a changing demographic looks like and the way it offers a parallel to higher education is to think about first recruitment. So kind of the more, as we've already mentioned, the diverse staff and students, but also not just kind of getting bodies on seats, but thinking about how we can become more inclusive. So making sure we don't just get more, you know, Black and brown students into a hostile environment, but how do we change and adapt our own kind of pedagogical practices or kind of intellectual practices, research kind of strategies in order to be informed by their experiences. And part of it comes down to a wish not to be uncomfortable, because this is a difficult things to talk about, and there's a desire to protect oneself from criticism. But I think that the thing that needs to be remains at the forefront is that we're talking about structural racism. We're not talking about individual acts of discrimination. We're talking about broader kind of organization of society functioning in a racialized way, and that if we seek to undo that, then we need to kind of challenge ourselves. And practically it has to do with funding as well. So with the Royal Historical Society report, there was, you know, plenty of funding involved in terms of actually printing the report out and circulating it to universities. This is a very kind of a low scale type thing, but it's incredibly important when you think about any research. So if you know, Irish Research Council puts money behind this, then I think that having an evidence bank becomes the first step in acknowledging those who kind of don't want to be convinced as a very first step.
Thank you. I wonder, could I ask Kevin to come in? I know this is an initiative that Glucksman House and I know you have been engaged with in the diasporic context. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah. There's really an interesting variation on this, you know, insofar as we're talking about the global Irish, and there's two quite different things going on in Irish America. One is a concern over what you might call the retention of an Irish American ethnic identity. In other words, in the absence of immigration from Ireland and in the absence of a unifying political question of the kind that there was a generation ago, what is the future of Irish America? Some people are working on that. You know, to give you a tangible example, there are about 35 million Americans self-identify as Irish, which always puts them in the top 3 or 4 groups in the country. But if you went back to 1990, you would find that the figure was over 40 million. So what's going on? What's going on is that people are making a choice. Ethnicity is an elective, and they choose to identify themselves. It's not like they have 4 Irish grandparents lined up to establish their bona fides. But so there's that is going on in Irish America. But the other thing that's so interesting is, and this is actually an initiative driven by my colleague, Dr. Miriam Naim Gray, starting at the level of oral history. There's a huge number of people who self-identify as African American, who have some degree of Irish ancestry and are acutely aware of that fact. And so what Miriam did was she opened up an oral history project, and there's a series of programs on the link that I shared for today, if people are interested, where people who would be identified as Black or African American in the American racial structure are discussing multiple aspects of their Irish heritage, whether from the level of family history to going back to the 19th century to slavery, and a spectrum of positive to traumatic history and memory. And so for my money, that opens up what is Irish America in the most dynamic and exciting way.
Just want to bring Jane in here. You mentioned a new project at Trinity to engage with, address, acknowledge, discuss Trinity's colonial past, and in particular its implications with slavery. Could you speak about that? Because it seems to me like this is obviously something that's been influenced, I guess, shaped by, as you said, similar initiatives in UK universities. But it also, as Laura suggested, takes on quite an acute resonance, doesn't it, with an Ireland that is more diverse, that has got people from African backgrounds, from Asian backgrounds, where all of those complicated and painful histories around slavery and the slave trade are all kind of bound up together in this new globalized Dublin that some of you live in. And could you talk about this project?
I could, absolutely, but I want to just come back to the Irish Research Council, because I actually will talk, it's something that we talk about in the context of council as well. And the IRC has been lobbying the European Commission to actually make funding available for really excellent, everything, it has to be excellent funding, excellent people to do excellent research, but precisely in this area as well. And my understanding is that the Commission are adopting basically a new strand that would allow us to explore the legacy of imperialism and colonialism very much in the context of Europe. But I think that's a very important, and that the IRC was lobbying for that. I appreciate Brexit, and I shouldn't mention the B word, but it means it's not quite as attractive to colleagues in the UK, but obviously it's important from an Irish and Danish perspective at least. In terms of Trinity, the whole Black Lives Matter conversation really impacted on our students. So to go back to what Shamina was saying, that actually this conversation in Trinity was driven to some extent by, it was coming from the bottom up, although I think my colleagues and I were very determined that we would do something anyway. So what we're doing is we're looking at our curriculum, we're looking at the whiteness of the history department, and not just the history department, but more generally across Trinity. We're also having conversations around the provenance of some of the materials, particularly in our library. I'm very interested on Ireland and India, and part of Tipu Sultan's library is in Trinity. You can begin to imagine how it got there. We've got some of the library from the last Mughal emperor that came after the storming of the Red Fort in 1857. So some is in Trinity, some is in Windsor Castle, and some is in Cambridge. I think Trinity needs to address these issues as an institution, and we were very struck by the work particularly that happened in Glasgow, and we're looking for funding from the college to do that. But we're also very conscious that a lot of our material collections are now part of the National Museum of Ireland. So in the National Museum, you've got the Trinity collection, you've got the RDS collection as well. And a lot of those artifacts, I think the provenance of those needs to be looked at and established, and there needs to be transparency around that. I'm very, very conscious that universities were tools of empire. Trinity was the oldest, but the other Irish universities, the Queen's colleges, obviously played their role as well. And I just think it's a very important moment to acknowledge it and actually to address it, but do it in a forensic way, that it's all about doing the research. And sadly, the research largely hasn't been done. So we're very much hoping, Caoimhe, that this new project will allow us to engage in all of this, but obviously using Trinity, but to do it obviously at a broader level too. I think the Royal Irish Academy is going to face similar issues.
Thank you. I want to turn from one great Irish institution, Trinity College Dublin, to another, the Irish Catholic Church. And I wonder if we might also consider the role of the church more explicitly, the church's missions abroad, but also the activities, also the activities of other churches in Ireland, missionary activities in Ireland, as part of colonial enterprise more broadly. This is a question that has been posed by Lisa Godson, and I'm conscious, of course, of the work of Colin Barr in talking about Ireland's spiritual empire under the leadership of Cardinal Cullen. But I mean, might we think of the Irish Catholic Church as engaging in another type of colonization, a spiritual colonization? I wonder, could I go to Tim first on missions and missionaries?
Sure. So, I mean, this is a hugely complex topic, partly because you're dealing with actually multiple empires simultaneously, right? I mean, if one thinks of the Catholic Church as being, a Roman Empire, there was the effort to expand into new territories, and as the British Empire expanded, and especially as Irish people were going out into the empire, there was the need, and from Roman perspective, to expand new dioceses and so forth. And Ireland provided a lot of the personnel for that, from priests and nuns to people managing schools, hospitals, etc. But there were other connections as well. For instance, the Society of African Missions, which had a seminary in Cork, was actually an offshoot of a French missionary enterprise. This was their English language site, if you will. So again, overlapping complexities here. And it went up and down the social scale. I mean, we tend to think of elites. I mentioned Jesuits before. They would have come from more well-off Catholic families, but something like the Society of African Missions had bursaries, and they recruited from poorer families. Colin and his student Rosalind Mello have written about a similar seminary, if you will, for poorer Catholic girls to go out into the empire. So, I mean, with all of this was popular culture also, because they were putting on fairs and so forth to make people aware of empire. And this gets into sort of small scale versions of the kind of material that Shamima is talking about, how people from abroad are portrayed, and especially racially portrayed beside the Irish. So it's incredibly complex.
Ian, I know you've spent a lot of time in Vatican archives. What perspectives can you bring to this question?
Well, actually, there's very little in the Vatican archives or the archives of Propaganda Fide that relates directly to Irish missionary activity in imperial contexts. The obvious one being the Caribbean, although Matteo Binasco has been working on the first attempts to supply Irish priests to the Caribbean. One thing I wanted to say is that that churches can be critics of empire and colonialism. I mean, at least critics of bad empire, as they might say it. And the classic case is Las Casas and the debate over the point of Spanish rule in South America. But there's also work by Andrew Porter and others on Protestant missionaries as critics of empire. In 18th century Ireland, the disaffection of Archbishop William King and his opposition to the penal code, and in some ways I think also the disaffection of Jonathan Swift, was caused by their feeling that colonialism was not serving its proper purpose, which was to save souls, but it was being used to take land. In the longer term, of course, you can see that the Catholic Church and Irish participants in Catholic missionary activity have served as agents of empire, but there's also that element of critique also.
Thanks. As the range and the quality and the number of questions that have been pouring into my my inbox from multiple platforms shows, there's a real appetite for discussion, for engagement, for challenges around what we think decolonising Irish history might be and what it might mean and how it can contribute to advancing our profession and our discipline. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I genuinely hope that this is the beginning of a set of conversations, the beginning of a series of events, the beginning of further discussions and reflections on what these questions and these issues might mean. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us, for engaging with such rich and thought-provoking questions. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Ian, Laura, Tim, Kevin, Jane, Shamima and Donal. I'd like especially to thank Torch Oxford, particularly Nikki and Justine, who've been working magic behind the scenes and providing all sorts of tech support and made the whole thing run much more smoothly than it would have done if I was trying to juggle and set up all of this. And thank you very much to everybody for being here. That's it. Goodbye.